Well, today, Camilla, the Labour MP, Kim Leadbeater, has been defending her bill to legalise assisted dying. Another group of MPs have actually put forward an amendment to the vote on Friday to scrap the whole process. Now, we know, Camilla, there's been huge concern amongst MPs, particularly because a private member's bill is a pretty unusual way to try and push through such an important policy change. So some have thought that Kim Leadbeater might be a little bit on the back foot. Maybe the mood of the House is moving against her. Let's listen to her this morning on BBC Breakfast, reacting to the attempts to get the bill thrown out.
I think that's really disappointing because, look, the public mood is clear. A, the public want us to have this debate. You've only got to look at your own inbox to realise that. And B, all the polling shows that society has moved on this issue and they want the law to change. So I think if anyone uses any sort of parliamentary processes to frustrate that, I think that would be wrong. And I think it would show Parliament in a really bad light. What I hope happens on Friday is we have a very thorough, robust, respectful and compassionate debate which shows Parliament at its very best. And indeed, because it is a free vote, because it's a vote of conscience, you will see people of different political parties with different views. And I think we've got a responsibility to the country, because this is a subject of national debate. I'm very, very acutely aware of that. Let's do Parliament as it should be done. Let's show it in its best light, and let's do what the public is asking us to do, and hopefully then take this bill through to the next stage so that debate can continue and these really important conversations about end of life, about palliative care, about death and dying, those conversations are allowed to take place and to continue.
Kim Leadbeater there mentioning the public view, and it's certainly something that has got you talking. A poll on the Telegraph website about this has attracted nearly 17,000 responses. Should the assisted dying bill be passed on Friday? 38% have said yes, 62% have said no. We've also heard from many of you in our emails. Gerda Pope writes, I feel so very strongly against assisted suicide, as the best well-intentioned safeguards can never be robust enough. Just yesterday I had a call from a cousin in Holland who is feeling very distressed. She had been summoned by the care home where her father with dementia was admitted a year ago, and it has just occurred to her that when she signed the forms authorising the home to care for her father, that it included care of his end of life. Also, using a life expectancy of 6 months will result in many lives being robbed. Certainly my good friend Marja would have lost 11 years of life with this benchmark. Those years were not always easy, but she definitely would not have wanted to miss them.
I think we've been really struck, haven't we, by people getting in touch with such strong and well thought through opinions on the different sides of this debate. Camilla, you and I are in slightly different places. Clearly, many of you are in different places. Julie got in touch with us to say, I understand the limitations of the assisted dying bill, but I fail to see why you do not support this. My family has had to cope with watching two much-loved family members having prolonged, painful deaths. They were given morphine, but it just didn't stop the pain, and in both cases were literally begging us to ask the doctors to let them die. We wouldn't let our beloved dogs go through that, so I don't see why we can't help our beloved family members. I live daily feeling I let them down in the last few months of their life. It was truly horrific. In these two cases, a hospice would have helped. Surely 2 doctors and a judge is enough to safeguard from the odd rogue. The nanny government just doesn't let us make decisions for our own nearest and dearest. I'm old enough to remember the IVF bill going through. It was hugely contested, but few people would change that bill today. Courage is needed, not fence-sitting.
If you want to get in touch, please do. The email is thedailyt@telegraph.co.uk, and of course, as ever, you can contact us on our socials at Daily Tea Podcast on X, Instagram and TikTok. As Julie alludes to there, some MPs are worried about the pressure that assisted dying might put on terminally ill people to end their lives early, and of course about the effect on those with disabilities. The bill does restrict assisted dying to terminally ill adults with 6 months or less to live, but we know that doctors simply aren't very good at predicting life expectancy, Kamal. A study of over 100,000 terminally ill patients showed that 6-month prognosis was only accurate in a third of all cases. Another third was still alive after a year.
This shows the very shaky foundations of one of the key supposed safeguards of the bill, that it will only be able to be used as a power to go towards assisted dying if you have 6 months or less to live. But doctors don't know whether people have 6 months or less to live. I think Kim Leadbeater does make a good point. If MPs on Friday try and collapse the bill with no vote, I think that will feel like we haven't had a proper debate and a proper chance. I don't imagine that many MPs would not want to at least be given the opportunity to have a substantive vote on the actual issue. Otherwise, it just feels like it was talked out and we never got to a decision. So let's see what happens on Friday. But I think she does make a strong point that a number of MPs, particularly those who support assisted dying, would feel robbed.
So in Canada, Kamal, they started out with a similar law to us, but in 2021, they changed its euthanasia law to no longer require that a patient's condition needed to be terminally ill. People whose condition is serious and incurable can now request it. Assisted dying now accounts for about 4.1% of all deaths in the country.
I think it is really important, Camilla, that we look at experiences around the world, particularly with this argument of slippery slope, that you start in one place, which is quite tightly defined, but then the constant pressure is to increase the number of people who can go down an assisted dying route. I spoke to Dr. Ramona Coelho. She's very much against assisted dying. She's a well-known physician from London, Ontario, prominent opponent of Canada's euthanasia regime from the beginning, and she was on an expert committee which reviewed euthanasia deaths. That review identified several cases in which patients were asked to be killed in part for social reasons, such as isolation and fears of homelessness, and that has raised pretty significant concerns over approvals for vulnerable people in the country's assisted dying system. I spoke to Ramona earlier this week and asked her how the Medical Assistance in Dying, or MAID program, came into existence. Dr. Ramona, thank you so much for joining the Daily Tea. I think it'd be wonderful just to kick off with some of the background it would be great to kick off with just some of the background in Canada. Medical assistance in dying was introduced 8 years ago after a legal challenge in the Supreme Court. Can you just take us through some of the history at that point and then what's happened since?
Sure. So in 2015, we had a Supreme Court decision, the Carter decision, where the justices ruled that an absolute prohibition on medical assistance in dying, or assisted suicide and euthanasia, which is the term MAID covers both of those terms, that an absolute prohibition would deny people their right to life, that they would have to commit suicide earlier if they were very physically disabled, and this would allow them to live longer and have someone help them end their lives when they wanted to. In 2016, our legislation, our first legislation was enacted, Bill C-14, which allowed people at the end of life who had intolerable suffering and were in a reversible state of decline to die with certain safeguards in place. Very quickly in 2021, there was an expansion to that law called Bill C-7, where a lot of the safeguards that were enacted to protect people at the end of life were dropped, with the priority of making assisted dying as accessible as possible to people in the end of life context, already a very broad end of life context. And a second pathway was opened up to people who were not dying, but who had intolerable suffering and were irreversible state of decline, so people with disabilities.
And Dr. Ramona, did those extensions happen because of legal actions or because of political and social pressure, or a mixture?
A mixture of both. So very quickly, the first legislation was challenged. Also, the terms that were used, reasonably foreseeable natural death, it was decided that that was not a disease prognosis, so that there was a challenge where it was decided that people could make themselves sick enough. It's not a binding court challenge, but there was a lower court that settled a case over this. There was the Truchon-Gladu case that happened in Quebec, also a lower court ruling, where a judge said that having people at the end of life only being able to access this program was not fair. And when the expansion happened, I would say it went further than the courts. And this largely depended on lobbying from Dying with Dignity, one of our most powerful and wealthy stakeholders, which is also granted charitable status in Canada, lobbied for extension to people who had solely mental illness as a medical condition, and that is legislated already to come into effect in 2027. We're currently deciding about advanced requests, meaning that someone could write in a document that if they become incapacitated, they would like MAID at that point, which is fraught with many ethical issues. But Quebec has decided to go ahead and do that, and Canada will likely shortly follow. And we have a recommendation, a formal one from Parliament, to expand to children. So there's a bit of both, but definitely the political will, the lobbying has gone further than what the courts initially suggested.
Now, you will know that on Friday here in the United Kingdom, we are having a very significant vote on the possibility of legalizing assisted dying. Given the experience of Canada, what do you think some of the warnings that have come from your country could be for our members of Parliament?
Well, I would say that I think most Canadians were not and are still not aware about what is happening with assisted dying. What are the concerns that people who actually are aware of what's happening, most Canadians remain unaware. And I would warn the United Kingdom that discrimination exists. We pretend that assisted dying is just about autonomy and compassion, and that it would only ever be used that way. But we don't understand, or many people don't realize, that clinicians hold a lot of the same biases that our society holds. And I doubt that the United Kingdom is very different from Canada, where there is high discrimination against people who are elderly, people who are disabled. All those unconscious biases might make their lives seem as less worth living, and therefore lead to them being more likely deemed as a compassionate act to end their life, when really solutions for suffering are not deeply dealt with here.
I believe that one of the reasons that the expansion of the number of people who could go through the assisted dying process is because of what's described as the burden on the health service, that there actually aren't the resources to enable the number of people who want to go through the process. Has that been a particular difficulty for Canada?
I'm sorry, did you say that people would not be able to access assisted dying because of a lack of resources, or they can't access the care that they want to live?
No, access the resources to go through the assisted dying process. The health service is too lacking in resources to enable people who want to facilitate assisted dying to actually be able to go through. My understanding is that that's part of the reason why there has been a delay until 2027 on this latest widening of the groups that can go through the assisted dying process.
Well, I think the government probably would be happy if people accepted that that was the reason for the delay. And that is part of what they've said, that the provinces says we're not ready. But what I would say, just to broadly address your question, is that people here do not have access to palliative care. I'm a member of the MAID Death Review Committee. We came out with our first government report for the province of Ontario, where we reviewed healthcare cases of concern of MAID. And also there were trends in that report. And for people accessing MAID, especially outside the end of life context, less than half had access to palliative care, versus access to medical assistance in dying is, on average, our province reported in July, 2.2 days to access the team. So what you have is a small group of people providing large amounts of MAID. We have I would say, relatively easy access. That's why we have 16,000 deaths from medical assistance in dying in 2023. And I would say that a lot of that is driven from what I see on the ground by a lot of lack of access to services. So palliative care is often, there's many volunteers, a lot of fundraising. MAID is 100% funded in this country. We have a lack of access to disability supports, home services, community services. All of these things can actually make someone desperate. It is relatively easy to end someone's life with a lethal injection, and that can be done in rural and remote communities. I was talking to a confrere who let me know that it is true that MAID provider goes to remote areas, but they do all their MAIDs at the same time, the same day. They've had to actually increase the size of their morgue to accommodate all the bodies whose lives will be ended on that same day because the MAID provider is making a visit that day. So I would not say that that is exactly true. I would say that it's the opposite. I think that clinical care, that there are a lot of health and societal policy failures that are leading people to get quicker and easier access to MAID. And as for why MAID for mental illness was actually delayed, I mean, the government would like to hide under that because they've lost face over pushing this and now having to push to stop. When we go back to the Carter case about what MAID was assisted dying was supposed to be for, although it is kind of like logical gymnastics or false logics, I would say, that we're trying to help people end their lives early at a certain point of time so that they don't have to commit suicide earlier. Well, you can't use that argumentation for mental illness. You are just ending people's lives instead of committing suicide. It is assisted suicide. And in terms of intolerable suffering, like in terms of the legislative pinnings of what were supposed to be safeguards so that people would wrongfully die, one of them is the irreversible state of decline and irremediability of disease. And actually, for mental illness, there can be people who suffer their whole lives. They are few, but they are real, and it's very sad. But the question is, can you accurately predict in real time who those people would be? No, you cannot. And that is extremely dangerous. I mean, if you look at the studies of how doctors can prognosticate about cancer, okay, we're pretty good. Not perfect still, but we're pretty good at saying like 3 or 6 months, etc. We can try to give people some real idea of what time they have left to live and how long they might suffer and how quickly we can end their suffering. But with mental illness, first of all, a lot of suffering is driven by social and policy failures. Again, a lack of community life, a lack of accommodation, a lack of care. So all of those things are failures that are driving mental illness. But two, you cannot predict accurately. If you had 100 people in front of 100 psychiatrists who looked like they were never going to get better, for years they had been suffering, the psychiatrists would not pick the right people who would not get better, and they would be wrong half of the time. So basically, you'd be giving MAID, assisted dying, for mental illness to people, half of them would have gotten better if you had taken care of them. That is not acceptable, and that is not what this regime was supposed to be about.
In the UK, the supporters of the assisted dying bill that will be voted on at the end of the week say that there are very strong safeguards here, that it is only for terminally ill people who have 6 months or less to live. And that means that some of the challenges that you have had in Canada will not be the case here. To which the response is the slippery slope response. Once you've started on this journey, more and more groups demand equality of treatment in assisted dying. I take all your points of actually the discriminatory nature of assisted dying, but they make that argument. Do you think that the evidence from Canada does show the dangers of the slippery slope? I'm wondering why the supporters of assisted dying have been so successful in expanding the number of people who can go through the process. I suppose what I'm getting at is, does slippery slope, is that inevitable once you started on this journey?
Actually, you touched on many, many good points. And I think I'll leave the slippery slope for last, because the first thing you asked me was, could this bill which is just for terminal illness and which has rigorous safeguards, protect all people in the United Kingdom from the wrongful deaths that we're seeing in Canada. I would say that even in the concept that there could be no coercion for, and I don't mean it in a way like coercion is like terrible family members. I'm talking about caregiver burnout, financial interests, all these different things that can play into decision making and that actually constrain our freedom, which is the opposite of choice. Two, I'm pretty sure the United Kingdom has the same issues with palliative care access that we have in Canada. And we have a lot of evidence that when people have high symptom burden from a lack of palliative care, that can drive the request for medical assistance in dying. So on the first level, I would urge the United Kingdom to focus on palliative care. That's the first thing. The second thing about the slippery slope, there's two things there. One, I think I said it at the beginning, I don't think Canadians know what's happening in Canada. I talk to my neighbors, they don't even know that it's allowed for people outside the end of life context. They don't know that you can get MAID on the same day if you have two MAID providers at the same day that you thought to request it before a deep dive of suffering and healing can take place, so that your worst day can become your last day, just like that. I don't think that that's a great way to die. Like, I think having existential therapy, being comforted, having closure, there are many better ways to die. And then in terms of the slippery slope, again, I think it's this false pattern. You know, what happened in Canada, do not be fooled. They told us the same thing. This would be an exceptional procedure, that doctors would know how to enact it every time perfectly. They would never get it wrong, which is impossible. But that discrimination would not play into it. That would totally be about patient choice. But when you are giving a death regime permission to end the lives of people who are the most marginalized, are most risk of discrimination in our country and in your jurisdiction, you are putting them in further danger.
Does the system of actually assisting people in death always work? The drugs, the practicality of actually people dying by their own hand, supported, physician supported?
Yes, that's a very good question. There was a study that recently came out of Oregon. I know I'm not from Oregon, but I think in the last year, someone took 137 hours to die by assisted suicide. And there's a range, a very broad range of the time it can take to die. And then people can have symptoms of distress in that. So I encourage people to look that up. In terms of Canada, it's very sad because actually, like I said, very little is getting out. But we know that there are been failed cases of MAID in the community, poor IV access, adverse reactions to drugs. There was some cases of interosseous attempts that went poorly. And there is no evidence in Canada because it is not studied. So our Ontario jurisdiction, our chief coroner did draw toxicology on many patients, but they were never run because it wasn't considered necessary. And so one, we don't have evidence about how people die. They're given a paralytic, and MAID assessors and providers here are very insulted that certain people have claimed that paralytic masks your effects and the patient could feel like they're drowning. This is the claims of an anesthesiologist, a Canadian anesthesiologist in the States, Joel Zavot, who studied patients under capital punishment, who has concerns about how people actually experience assisted dying via the IV drugs that we give. But even aside from that, we have documented failed cases of MAID in the community where people have groaning and adverse effects, and it has lasted long and caused distress to the family and the patient.
Just finally, Dr. Ramona, we have this incredibly significant vote on Friday. It is unclear which way it is going to go. For MPs, and I'm sure members of Parliament here in the UK, and I'm sure there are many members of Parliament in this situation who are still undecided, who are seeing the arguments around dignity in dying as it's described by those who support assisted dying, a way to have autonomy in death, and those who argue much more closely, Dr. Ramona, to where you are about the great risks of stepping over this Rubicon, what would you say to them, people who are still conflicted by this very moral as well as practical debate about how to support people at end of life?
I would say this, that I understand how it can be framed as a compassionate choice for those who have intolerable suffering. But I would say that the reality of end-of-life care, of social context and social constructs, of policy and health failures must be considered. This is a public policy. This will have implications on everyone, not just a few people who might really want to die on their own terms. And how a policy affects everyone is extremely important. So in Canada, it was rolled out like thinking about, oh, that only one person who we want to end their suffering right away. First of all, it's a fictionalized person. In reality, I see many people who have made the decision to get made because they can't take care of their loved one at home anymore. And it's not been a great decision for them. It's been one born of desperation. If you look at our Health Canada reports, people often cite loneliness or feeling a burden as the reason they choose MAID. That is not a compassionate act that we're giving for people who are exercising their choice. Those are desperate people who are being forced to make really bad decisions that the same government is offering people death that is not offering the same quality of life, to the point where our Human Commissioner of Canada and the UN has raised real concerns about how we treat marginalized persons, people who are poor, people who are disabled and are elderly, people who deserve the most care but are instead being offered the worst, which is death.
Dr. Ramona, thank you for joining the Daily Tea and sharing your expertise.
My pleasure. Nice to meet you.
Let's stay in Canada next to hear from somebody on the other side of the debate. Jim Cowan is a veteran lawyer and retired senator from Nova Scotia. He is a board member and former chair at Dying with Dignity Canada. He also sat as a member of Parliament's Special Joint Parliamentary Committee on Physician-Assisted Dying and has previously tried to change assisted dying laws to include people with mental health issues.
Let's hear our conversation with Jim. I first asked him why he supports assisted dying. Senator Cowan, thank you so much for joining us on the Daily Tea. I think firstly it'd be very helpful for us just to hear your background and your judgment on the journey that Canada's been through, from assisted dying being illegal to where we are today.
Right. I think one major difference is that in Canada, the impetus came from the courts. As you say, assisting somebody to die was illegal against the provisions of our criminal code. And the Supreme Court of Canada struck down that provision in 2015 and said that was contrary to our Charter of Rights and Freedoms, and said, all right, we've struck it down. Now we'll suspend our judgment for a year or two, and Parliament, if it wants to, can enact legislation within the parameters that we've set out in our judgment. So the impetus came from the courts, and so the government of the day struck an expert panel, and then in Parliament, I was in the Senate at the time, and we struck a joint committee of senators and members of Parliament to look at the issue, and I was a member of that committee, and we reported to the government and made some recommendations, and then the government came forward with legislation in early 2016, which was debated in both chambers, amended a bit, and passed. And that's the basic structure which remains in place today. There was, but one of the criteria that was set forth in the 2016 legislation was that one's natural death had to be reasonably foreseeable, and that was struck down by a subsequent court decision that said that provision was contrary to the Charter, and so it was removed a couple of years ago. So no longer does your natural death have to be reasonably foreseeable, but you have to be suffering intolerably from a disease or condition which is not capable of being treated with any treatment that you're prepared to accept, and you have to be on a steady decline. So We've had 8 years of experience with this regime now, and in my judgment, and in the it's worked very well. We've had numerous public opinion polls over that period of time, and they show that 80 to 85% of Canadians support medical assistance in dying. There's still a vocal minority who object to the whole idea and to any suggestion that it might be extended further.
Can you just tell us why you, Senator, support assisted dying?
Well, for me, it's a matter of personal choice. I believe very much in personal freedom and human dignity. And for me, it is very much a question of this is a right which ought to be available to people who qualify according to the very strict criteria that is set forth in the legislation. And it's for, I believe that I should be able to make my own judgment based upon my own beliefs and my own personal situation, and it shouldn't be dictated to by somebody else. And it's a choice for me to make. It's a personal choice. It's about autonomy and freedom. And I recognize that there are people, for very good reason, who are opposed to this for moral or religious or ethical reasons, and that's fine. I respect that. And they have every right. There's nobody being forced. This is to accept medical assistance in dying. It's a matter of personal choice.
Senator Cowan, you've said there that you've had 8 years now of this legislation being in place, that it's gone quite well, that it's got 85% of people in Canada supporting it. And yet you do want to take it further. You would like to include people with mental illnesses to allow them to opt for assisted suicide or assisted dying, as well as those covered by the law so far. And I suppose I would beg the question, if it ain't broke, then why fix it? One of the chief concerns about the legislation in this country is that it's very strictly going to be confined to people who have got 6 months or left to live with a terminal illness dictated by doctors. And one of the arguments against in Britain is we don't want to create a slippery slope where it includes, for instance, people with mental health problems.
Right. Well, we had the same slippery slope argument presented to us back when I was on the committee, the joint committee that I spoke about, and it remains a talking point for people who are opposed to this. My view is that I know people, as you would as well, who are suffering from an incurable, intractable mental illness, and they suffer, in my view, just as much as those who have cancer or some neurological disease or some other physical illness. And to me, it's discriminatory to say that you ought to be excluded from access to medical assistance in dying simply because the cause of your suffering is a mental illness rather than a physical illness. I think they ought to be available on the same basis. They have to meet the same criteria. It can't simply be a temporary depression or something, but we all know people who have suffered from mental illness for years and years and years and suffer. I can't believe how much they suffer, and why should we discriminate against them and refuse to allow them access to a human right which is available to everyone else whose suffering is physical? And many of these situations, you have comorbidity, you have a mental illness as well as a physical illness. It's important to note that in order to qualify in Canada, you have to be a competent adult, so that if your mental illness, as an example, deprived you of your competence, legal competence, then no matter how much you are suffering, you would not be able to access medical assistance and die.
I suppose the counter argument to that is, in the case of people suffering from severe depression and mental illness, the medical approach is always to try and help them to find ways out of their despair and desperation, and at all costs to discourage them from suicide. And yet what you're advocating is for them to do the opposite. And maybe people might draw a distinction between, for instance, incurable cancer, I'm sorry, there's nothing more we can do. The chemo won't work, the radiotherapy won't work. I'm afraid it's just a matter of weeks now, compared with there still being a chink of hope with medication and therapies for those who are suffering from mental illnesses comparatively.
But I think that's you put that argument very well. I think the answer to it is that in Canada, as I'm sure in the UK, you can't be forced to accept treatments against your will, whether they're treatment for mental illness or for physical illness. And the fact in Canada is that the people who would, if MAID were available to folks whose sole underlying cause of suffering was mental illness, these are not people who are depressed because they lost a job or had a relationship breakup or something. These are people who are in the system, have been receiving treatment for years and years and years, and simply say, look, I can't go on like this anymore. I just can't do it. And these are not people who have just a recent onset of depression these are, and according to the information which I have and the people that I've spoken to who are experts in this field, these are people who have been in the system for many, many years, have received care. They're not people who can't get in to see a psychiatrist or a psychologist. They're people who've been in the system. Everybody can't be cured, and it's possible perhaps that someday something might come along and an illness and that mental illness might be cured. But in the meantime, these people are suffering intolerably, and in my judgment, they ought to have equal access. But that's not the case in Canada now.
You've passed legislation to expand the number of people that can make use of assisted dying pathways to include disabled people, as we're discussing serious mental health problems. There's a practical issue, though, isn't there here, Senator, which is that can the services actually cope? And what's actually been agreed there is that the change is going to have to be delayed because there's not the capacity in the system. And one of the criticisms here has been not enough preparation has been done, whether or not we support or don't support assisted dying, in actually ensuring that the health service, the social care service, palliative care services are able to deal with a possible new right to assisted dying. And so hasn't that been a problem in Canada? You've now had to delay this until 2027 because the system cannot cope.
Well, I think that let's deal with that issue first. I think that the reason why the exclusion was extended to 2027 is simply that there is division. There's not the same kind of overwhelming public support and clinical support for what I described. There are the professional community is very much divided on this. I'm sure you've found psychiatrists and others in Canada who are opposed to this. I think it is a slippery slope, and that there is mental illness ought to be treated differently than physical illness. And if there's a glimmer of hope, then that hope ought to be encouraged rather than taken away. And there are also a lot of people who would argue that that we ought to focus on providing palliative care for people who are at this stage in their lives, and that ought to be the focus. And to allow an expansion or extension or encouragement of MAID takes the focus off where the real need is. Now, there's no question that in Canada, and I suspect in Britain as well, there needs to be more focus, more attention, more money spent on providing palliative care everywhere and to more people. But in Canada, when we looked at the statistics, and the people who've received MAID in Canada, about 78% were receiving palliative care at the time. And of the people who were not receiving palliative care, that's another 20% or so, 90% had access to palliative care and chose not to use it. So there are only a very small number of people in Canada so far who received MAID who didn't at least have access to palliative care. Now, we believe, or I believe, our organization Dying with Dignity Canada believes that we ought to provide more and better and more accessible palliative care. But it's not an either-or situation. And to the question of demand, there are no resources being taken away from other services, health services, to provide MAID in Canada. It's not a large number of people. We find that now it's true that Canada's a large country. There are a lot of remote communities, and access to assessors and providers is easier in Toronto, Montreal, Vancouver, Halifax than it is in Nunavut and some of the remote communities. And that's a problem which exists for all health care services and other kinds of services. But the argument that resources are being taken away from the provision of healthcare services, or would be taken away from those services if it was available to those whose suffering is caused by mental illness, just doesn't. There's no basis for that.
You've touched on some of the medical experts' criticism of this expansion. You'll know the arguments, which are it's being offered to vulnerable people. There's a lack of services generally to support them. This appears to normalise a so-called easy way out. Often homelessness, isolation are put as reasons for taking assisted dying. I just wondered if that gave you ever any pause for concern that what is actually happening here is that people who are in situations of intense loneliness, intense isolation, not having the services they need to live a full life, often disabled people, that's been a big discussion here in the UK, that it's discriminatory. The present MAID system in Canada is discriminatory against those people who are not through coercion or persuasion, but just feel this is the easiest option.
Well, I think that would be the case if one could simply say, well, look, I'm making this decision and I want MAID. But the fact is that you have to meet these very strict criteria, and you have to have two health professionals, independent, who say that you have that you have a serious illness, disease, or disability, that you're in an advanced state of decline, that you're experiencing unbearable or physical or mental suffering which can't be alleviated by any treatment which is acceptable to you, and so the fact that you're homeless, the fact that you're lonely, the fact that you don't have sufficient means to feed yourself and that sort of, those are terrible situations, and government needs to do more to address those concerns. But that's not enough. Just being in that situation wouldn't qualify you for MAID in Canada. And the argument, I've heard this argument that, well, there are people getting MAID simply because they're homeless, or they're desperate because they're under pressure from family members who are don't like to see what they see as their inheritance wasted on keeping someone alive. Well, that's those arguments been made. They were made back at the time we were talking about this in 2016, but they're not factually correct, and there's no evidence that has actually happened in Canada. And I think we have to be very vigilant that it doesn't. And so an assessor has to make sure that there aren't outside pressures on people who say, well, go and apply for MAID, you need to get medical assistance at dying, or that we don't have a place for you in a care facility, so you should apply for medical assistance. You wouldn't qualify.
Senator, one final question, perhaps on a practical level, because I think people are wondering exactly how this will play out for them should the legislation go through Parliament in the UK. You've talked there about it working in Canada that the patient has to be compos mentis in order to opt for this, obviously with medical approval. So, for instance, if you don't mind me being this personal, in your case, obviously you are a vocal advocate for assisted dying. You seem in very robust health, both physically and mentally now. What do you do? Do you write a living will and you let your loved ones know that in the case of incapacity, this is what you want? How do you provide for it in your own case?
Well, that's the next. There's no provision in Canada now for an advance request. And that's the next, if you like, the next stage of the battle. I believe very much that I should be able to provide an advance request now that I'm in reasonable health and have most of my marbles, that I should be able to say, well, look, if I reach this stage, I'm not able to recognize my members of my family. I'm not able to communicate. I'm not able to feed myself. I'm incontinent. I don't want to, those are conditions that would be intolerable for me to live under. And at that point, I would want to have MAID. There's no provision in Canada for that. And that, although it's been recommended by the joint committee that I sat on and a subsequent joint committee that was struck a couple of years ago, the government has not moved forward with that move. I very much believe that just as I can provide a power of attorney, a request for health care, I can say, look, if I have a stroke and I'm in hospital and there's no reasonable prospect of my recovery, I don't want to be resuscitated. I don't want any heroic means used to keep me alive. Physicians will respect that. And I can say, I don't want to be fed. I don't want to be watered. And I will die. And that's the alternative. So I think that a logical extension of where we are now is that there ought to be provision for folks like us who appear to be reasonably competent to make an advance request, but that's not possible under Canadian law.
Senator Cowan, I suppose some critics would say that again shows that once you start on this journey, there are constant requests, some of them, like you've just made, very reasonably put, to constantly extend the ability to take assisted dying as a course of action. That would mean that it wouldn't be for people here who are obviously terminally ill. It would be for people who were in good health but wanted in the future to have what's described maybe as a living will. Senator Cowan, could I just ask you just finally, lots of MPs here are grappling and are probably right on the border. It's been a very interesting and mostly respectful debate here about whether we should move to legalising assisted dying. If you had a member of parliament in front of you who could see all the negatives, some of which Camilla and I have gone through, could see the positives that you've outlined, what would you say to him or her about why on Friday and the vote here in the UK you should opt for assisted dying, given the balance of the arguments here that we haven't done this yet, it is not legalised, and it would move us into a completely different discussion and relationship between the medical profession, the state, and individuals?
Yes. Well, I would say that look at the individual, focus on the patient, on the person, and the rights, the fundamental rights, human rights of the individual to control his or her own dying to this extent. And it's about compassion, it's about personal choice, and fundamental rights. And I would say, focus on that and not on the role. I'm a lawyer, so I could say there's a place for lawyers, but this is not it's not a legal judgment. It's not a medical judgment. It's a personal judgment. And it's a right, it's a choice which individuals ought to be able to make. Some individuals will choose medical assistance in dying, and others will say, well, that's not for me. And that's as it should be. So I would say focus on the individual.
Senator Cowan, thank you very much indeed for joining us from Canada. It's been great to get your perspective on this.
Happy to do so. Thank you for having me.
I must admit, I find listening to Senator Cowan quite disturbing. You go from a situation where the safeguard is only for people with a short amount of time to live. you broaden that out to a situation where people in great physical distress are allowed to access assisted dying, and then acute mental illness, that's coming next in Canada, and then Senator Cowan saying that actually it should be part of your living will. Now, that is actually necessary. I think if you believe in assisted dying, if you have dementia, David Baddiel tweeted about this, if you have dementia, you can't say with 6 months to go, okay, now I want to go through assisted dying because you're not capable. So it's a logical conclusion of the journey. But Canada, one of the key proponents of assisted dying in Canada, now wants to go to living wills with an euthanasia clause.
And also when he was speaking about mental health and he was saying, well, you'd have to be significantly ill for a long time. I was like, okay, well, put an age limit on it then. Say that you can't opt for this if you've got mental problems until you're 60. It's so complex, and I think both sides of the argument are compelling, but I still remain where I am against. We will, of course, be bringing you the latest from that vote on Friday, as well as our normal podcast. Kamal, that's us done for another day. Back tomorrow, 5 p.m.